Sì, anzi, I love it.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. A genuine appeal for peace and negotiations, or a gambit to intensify the conflict? These are only some of the questions surrounding the Ukrainian president's call for a ceasefire. Anti-Kiev forces in the east say it's a trap. Poroshenko's options are narrowing. To Crosstalk Poroshenko's so-called truce, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. In New York, we have Don DeBar. He is an anti-war activist and host of a daily radio program. And in Washington, we cross to Ivan Elan. He is the senior fellow and director of Independent Institute. All right, Crosstalk rules. In fact, gentlemen, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Marcus, if I go to you first in London, does Poroshenko ask for a ceasefire out of strength or out of weakness?
Well, can I just first of all say, Peter, it's a good thing that Russian news outlets are covering the conflict in Ukraine in depth, because if Western media had the field for themselves, the world wouldn't be hearing about this terrible, dreadful conflict which is incurring civilian casualties every single day. But, you know, President Poroshenko, he's approaching the conflict in a very duplicitous manner. On the one hand, he talks of wanting to bring peace to the region and to have negotiations, but on the other hand, he's maintaining and prosecuting a terrible offensive, which is resulting in just awful civilian casualties. So I believe that Poroshenko is playing a very, very dangerous game here. I think he's trying to lure the militiamen fighting against Kiev's forces into a false sense of illusion while continuing to prosecute a military campaign using Grad rockets, using the Air Force, using tanks. So personally, I don't think any credence should be given to anything that Poroshenko says when he claims he wants to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine in a peaceful manner. It's ludicrous. You know, Don, there's one thing that the government in Kiev has been able to prove is it can kill civilians pretty well, and I guess it's the only thing it's been able to do, because its own military is proven to be quite inept here. You know, from a Western Ukraine perspective, he better start getting some results, because those guys on the Maidan have been monitoring him. I'm talking about right sector people here. And he talks to words of peace, but he really needs to get this resolved pretty quickly, because his own power might be at stake.
Well, first, I think to describe his job description, I would go to what the permanent representative from Russia to the UN, Vitaly Churkin, said, which is he's really a translator, not a president. His job is to translate instructions from English into Ukrainian. And he's been doing that fairly well. We've had the visits from various parts of the U.S. government to Kiev right before the predecessor and this government attacked yet again the people in Ukraine. The people in Ukraine. I mean, it's the eastern part of the country, but if you look at an electoral map from the 2010 election, the last president, the deposed president, pulled about a third of the vote in Kiev. It's not as monolithic in the West as it's portrayed here. So Ukrainians are Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian military, which, by the way, part of the reason that it is so inept is that there have been massive desertions from the beginning when this coup government and its successor said to attack its own people. This is really a proxy war by the United States being fought against the people of Ukraine, with a Comprador group fully established by coup in Kiev. And I think the opposition, perhaps in Lvov and you know, some other smaller parts of the West, the very far West, that are traditionally attached to Poland, you won't see as much. But there is support for the people in the East and for their own rights in large parts of Western Ukraine that we haven't seen expressed yet.
Ivan Elan, in Washington, we came across that famous telephone conversation with Victoria Nuland. You know, if there's one recording, there's got to be a few hundred, if not a few thousand recordings of her instructions to Kiev. How much do you think the U.S. is behind whatever strategy Poroshenko has?
Well, I think probably to a great extent. I wouldn't necessarily
go as far as Don, but I do think the U.S. has heavily influenced this because, of course, they're providing the assistance, and of course the EU is backing up this with economic loans, and so is the United States. So both financially and militarily and advising the Ukraine, certainly the U.S. has a big role, and I think the United States looks on this as the Ukraine as a real prize, and a friendly government in Ukraine to the United States, of course, is better than a government that's friendly to Russia. And I think the EU has behaved. Really started this crisis by saying it's all or nothing for Ukraine, and I think Ukraine really has to nestle between the two blocks, and it also has to have autonomy in the East simply because of the political situation there. Whether we'll get to that point, I don't know, but certainly there's a tug of war there to try to wrest Ukraine from the Russian influence.
Marcus, it's very interesting. Ivan said something that I think is absolutely right, is that, the European Union is uncompromising. This government in Kiev is uncompromising. No negotiations. This is insanity here, and this is what's causing all of these deaths. Poroshenko mentioned decentralization, federalization. That's been talked about for months now. All of a sudden, he talks about it as if it's his own idea.
Absolutely, because for the United States government and the European Union, it's a matter of it's our way or the highway. There's no compromise, and the way in which Ukraine has been treated by the EU and the United States is disgraceful. Ukraine should have been allowed to choose under its democratically elected leader, President Yanukovych, whether it wanted to pursue economic relations with Russia or with the European Union. And President Yanukovych had a mandate. However, that didn't fit into the agenda of those in Washington and those in Brussels. They wanted to see Ukraine come away from Russia and firmly entrench itself in the West by joining the European Union and eventually joining NATO. When we hear Western politicians talking about we have to sit down and talk in a reasonable manner about Ukraine, that's just empty talk. That's empty rhetoric. The reality is that there is no compromise, and all we need to do is look in the east of the country. We've got a Ukrainian military that is inept and has proven itself to be inept, and yet it's still fighting this bloody war. And of course, if Poroshenko wasn't being backed politically, economically, and also undoubtedly militarily by people in Washington and in Brussels, would he really be still prosecuting this war when the Ukrainian military is not achieving any progress?
Don, the further this goes on, the more of a identity issue arises in the east of Ukraine, because before all of this nonsense, this invented crisis, I really want to stress that, invented crisis, public opinion polls in the east of the country, people didn't want to join Russia. Well, every day that passes, more deaths. People are going to rethink that, and then we're going to even have a bigger problem here because we're going to have a self-partition. And then Washington, being uncompromising, wants everything. This is a catastrophe.
Well, I mean, some people are alluding to this as being a replay of the 15th century or something, and I guess if you wanted to go back that far, which is pre-Columbus in this hemisphere, you could, but I think the context of bloc politics that was referenced earlier, although it applies in fact, I don't think is a necessary precondition to the current situation. It's rather something that's been created by the West. I don't know how much Russia has to do to show that it would like to be integrated into the rest of the world politically, socially, and economically. It dismantled the Soviet Union. It dismantled the socialist economy. It did everything that was asked of it, and then some, from 1991 until, the last few months, really. And yet, it is the one that's separated from the G8. In fact, the G8 becomes the G7. And, it's ostracized. So the creation itself of blocs and a bloc tension, this is a creature nature of the West, and it serves a particular purpose. The purpose is to serve the interests of the elite here that do not want to see competing centers of power, economic, political, social, whatever, anywhere in the world, but rather vassals to whatever state organization they have control of at the moment. It's the United States military, it's the European political construct. They had hoped, although now they're turning on China, to use China's economic power also as a part of this construct. And this is almost like looking at, Molotov-Ribbentrop in Poland back in 1939 in terms of the break in the real estate between the two blocs. If I were doing strategic planning for the Russian military, I'd have to be looking at it that way and looking, at this basically as the beginning of an invasion of Russia. Physically. I mean, how many military assets do you have to deploy to the theater before people on the other side start thinking that way?
Well, that's exactly how they're thinking about it in this country where I live. I mean, Elon, how far do you think Washington is going to go to get the prize called Ukraine, minus Crimea?
Well, I think, it has to be
necessarily.
They have to be somewhat subtle in their approach, because Ukraine is a little different than some of the other countries. And I do agree with Don. I think this is a Western-imposed block system, because I think, if you recall, George Bush the First verbally promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand. Well, of course, NATO has repeatedly expanded right up to Russia's borders, and so that's created the reality. What should have been done after the Cold War is, if you wanted to keep NATO as a talk shop, invite Russia to join as a full member, and not have blocks. But and that's the root of the problem here.
Okay.
Of course,
all right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT.
I love it.
Does the media lead us or we lead the media? Privacy versus security. All right, your party, where's it going? The questions that no one is asking with the guests that you deserve answers from. It's all on politicking, only on RT.
Join me on Boom Bust for in-depth, impartial, and en vogue financial reporting, commentary, interviews, and much, much more. Only on Boom Bust and only on RT.
Choose your language.
Good morning from me, Kevin Owen. If Bienvenidos a nuestra edición semanal.
Choose the news that concerns you. Choose the opinions that invigorate your mind. Choose the stories that impact your life. Choose the access to your RT.
I don't see why it should be a problem for any country to diversify its sources of supply or of demand. That's, as I said from the beginning, sensible energy policy.
I love it.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent developments in Ukraine. Okay, I'd like to go back to Marcus in London. The person known as Yats, he'll be remembered as Yats because of Victoria Nuland. He said he wrote on a website in the United States for the Ukrainian embassy and referred to Russians as subhuman. But nobody seemed to pick up that in Western media. We did, of course, and I'm going to talk about it. What do you think about that? The last time I heard a term like that in Europe was in the 1940s.
Well, one of the realities stemming from President Yanukovych being overthrown was that neo-Nazis and anti-fascists in Ukraine are now playing a role in deciding Ukraine's future. However, there are other groups, and I would refer to them simply as uncouth individuals who hold positions of power within the Ukrainian government, referring to Russians as subhumans. A so-called foreign minister, and I use that term in a very loosely way, referring to President Putin and Russia in a derogatory way. Is this really what 21st century Europe is all about? Is this what a country called Ukraine is supposed to be in the modern civilized era, where individuals are referring to Russians as subhumans? And as you said, the last time Russians were referred to subhumans, that was back in the 1940s. Nazi ideology, and that resulted in the awful deaths of 30 million Russians. And yet there's no condemnation by the West. Why? Because the West has a history of working with odious groups when it serves its interests. You know, I don't want to divert us away from Ukraine, but look, every year in the Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia, there are Waffen-SS veteran parades. Who in Washington or Brussels has ever condemned those parades? What would happen if it happened in London or Berlin? There would be outcry, and rightly so. And in Ukraine, you have people in the Ukrainian government referring to Russians as subhumans. That's completely unacceptable. It's appalling. And yet there's no condemnation, because these people in Kiev making these comments are the tools of the West. They're the tools of the West to bring Ukraine away from Russia and thereby weaken Russian influence in Europe and in the world ultimately.
You know, Don, I don't know if you saw Jen Psaki's comments about those comments, and I was just left completely speechless. Maybe you don't have a comment and you were left speechless as well. Go ahead.
I actually spoke to the monitor when I saw it. I do the daily newscast.
I bet you did. I bet you did.
Covering a press conference. Yeah, and you know, so she said it was inhuman instead of subhuman.
No, it was originally...
And somehow that's different. And I think, of course, I mean, if you go to the song about Jen Psaki that's been circulating the internet, perhaps she meant inhumane. But in context, it's clear. And also, she said, and also the translation now is inhuman, which is the same as subhuman, only worse. Subhuman is below human. Inhuman is just not human at all. And so that was her explanation. But look, the larger context is this happened the same week that you have a riot and an attack on the Russian embassy in Kiev. And Vitaly Churkin at the UN cannot get anyone at the United Nations Security Council to deal with it. And finally, after much negotiation, they've at least had discussions about it. In addition to that, with the situation in Slavyansk and the other places that are under siege in East Ukraine, at the Security Council, the United States, through its proxy, one of the Baltic states acting as proxy, refusing to allow a discussion or, in any event, a resolution to come forward looking for relief, for humanitarian relief for the people. They're saying that there's no precedent cause. In other words, there is nothing going on in eastern Ukraine that would require humanitarian relief. Now, it doesn't make sense looking at the facts on the ground, where you have tens of thousands of refugees, water supplies disrupted, all these other things. But if you don't consider the people there human, if they're inhuman, suddenly humanitarian relief is, of course, not appropriate, because that's for humans. That's exactly, it's not even subtext. That's what's being spoken in the capitals, and all of the norms for embassies, all these other things are being completely abrogated in plain view without the United Nations or any other structures dealing with it whatsoever. It's a pretty frightening prospect.
It is frightening, and Ivan Elan, if I go back to you in Washington, it's all because it really has very little to do with Ukraine. It has everything to do with Russia, doesn't it?
Yes, I think it does. It's trying to get as much of the near abroad away from Russia as it can. And I think some of your other participants here have touched on something. I think, this is rhetoric we're talking about now, but as the conflict goes along, it's going to become more bitter, like the Syrian civil war has become more bitter. And I think you're going to see radicalization. The other comment I would make is that the double standard is not just covers rhetoric, it also covers actions. I mean, Putin was heavily criticized in the West for going into Crimea, but we see no equal criticism in the United States of the Kurds for grabbing oil-rich Kirkuk. So even such actions have a double standard here in the West. Russia gets very amazingly slanted media coverage here in the United States.
Yeah, that's why I keep doing this topic, okay? Marcus, you were nodding your head. What element of what Ivan just said you agree with there?
Well, I think it's so important to clarify that in the 1990s, the West was happy to see Russia integrated with the rest of the world. Why was it happy with that in the 1990s? Simply because Russia at that point was on its knees. It was on its knees politically, economically, militarily. It was totally dependent on the West for IMF loans just to try and stabilize the Russian economy. So the West was happy then. However, today in 2014, it's a very different Russia. Russia is standing on its feet. It's not dependent on the West anymore. And therein lies the problem for the West, that the West doesn't have that sort of global dominance that it once had in the 1990s. So it has to look around the world to countries which can try and weaken Russia's influence. And Ukraine is a huge area, it's a huge piece of the jigsaw, that if Ukraine was to come into the EU and NATO, Russia on its western borders effectively would be enclosed and it would be dramatically weakened. But then you have to have a look in Syria. The Americans have helped cause a conflict there, resulting in the deaths of over 100,000 people. Well, it's no coincidence that Syria and Russia traditionally have close relations, and if the Syrian government was to fall and extremists were to come to power, Russia would all but lose its influence in the Middle East. So it's a game of chess that the Americans are playing.
You know, Don, is one of the things that's not really reported very. I mean, the story gets so bad coverage in the West. But there's another story here that is very interesting, is that the Russian people are getting very, very frustrated with the situation going on in East Ukraine, because you know what? They're the same people. And watching it, and we will see all the feeds. I mean, it's all sanitized in the West. We see everything here, and it's really, really disgusting. And it really is beginning to bother people here, because something must be done. And Putin has been very strong in saying, no, we're not going to go in there. We can't fix a problem that the West started in the first place. But, you know, there's that other element here. There's a lot of pressure on Putin at home.
Yeah. I mean, I'm seeing it with commentators, for example. I guess I won't go into names, but, you know, people that are on the show that are stressed over Putin not going in. And I understand that sentiment to a degree.
I do, too.
You know, you have to look at the reality. I'm sorry. You have to look at the reality of the situation. You first of all have people in Western Ukraine that are, you know, working class people that are sort of like clan members in the South. They are easy to mobilize. You know, their situation is uncomfortable for them. They don't understand what's going on around them. They feel disempowered. Some hotshot points at the people in the East. It's the Russians, you know, those people, they're not like you, it's their fault. And that's who they direct their hate at. And that mobilizes a core group so you can fill up, for example, the Maidan. But then there are people on top of them who are actually organizing this kind of stuff, who look at say, the mines or the factories in the East, wannabe oligarchs or present oligarchs who would like to be sitting on top of that. To the west of them, you have people in the EU looking over the shoulder of those people in the West, saying, if we let these guys in Kiev take that stuff over, we'll just take them over. And then further than that, you have the U.S. That's kind of how you construct this sort of thing. But the real key here is that the prize is not Ukraine. The prize is Russia. Ukraine is the doormat into Russia that the U.S. has been looking for since the beginning of the Cold War, and even earlier. If you go back to the period right after the revolution, you will see that there was a proxy war fought in Kiev, more or less in Ukraine, more or less over the same fracture lines, geographically and socially, as now, with the West using anti-Soviet and anti-Russian proxies in Western Ukraine to fight. That ultimately led to Ukraine being brought into the USSR. But immediately towards the end of the USSR, it was the whole chain of people in early 1990, from Kiev to Lvov, I think, that were some of the early inside the USSR proponents of dissolving it. And of course, sorry, I don't think that was spontaneously organized.
It wasn't here. Hang on, Don, let me go to Ivan Elan. Let me go to Ivan, give him the last word here on the program. Do you think that Washington wants Russia to invade eastern Ukraine?
Well, they say they don't, but of course, you never know. I think that they probably would prefer not to, because I think they like the friendly government in Ukraine, and I think that's very important, but they've got to find some way to pacify the eastern regions. And so, you know, they may eventually come to some sort of an autonomy situation, and if they could get that, that's probably what they would want. I don't think they really want to. I think they would like to dampen the conflict there, but of course they definitely want the Ukraine in the Western camp.
Okay, gentlemen, fascinating discussion. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London, New York, and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
안씨.
Scientists.